Welcome, everyone. Well, you're all gathering. Maybe we can start with the intro and then wait for everyone to join in. So for those of you who are new here, Adeva is a remote network of tech professionals, and our goal is to enable work without boundaries. So this is part of that same effort. We have this Fireside Chat Series where we bring industry leaders to all of you so that you can learn from their experience and best practices, regardless of where you are in the world. And today it's a pleasure to welcome Lindsay Kerr. She's an engineering manager at GitLab, and we will discuss how to build engineering processes that deliver results when working with distributed teams. Feel free to share your questions on Slido, or if you're following us on Zoom in the Q&A section, some of my colleagues will share the Slido link both here and on YouTube as well. We'll make sure to circle back to that and answer as many questions as possible at the end. Great. So Lindsay, welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Katarina. It is a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to have you. Let's start with kind of a broad question. So your team has been fully distributed at GitLab. I know you have previous experience working with distributed teams as well. But, you know, when it comes to GitLab, definitely the leader when it comes to creating strong processes and working with distributed teams. So as a first question, I wanted to ask you how the engineering process looks like over there. And maybe you can compare it with your past experience or with a general experience, you know, working with teams that are, you know, co-located.
Sure. I'll start by saying that pretty much everything I'm going to share today is available in our handbook. One of my favorite things about GitLab is our transparency. So unless we have a real reason to make something private, it is all out on about.gitlab.com. So if you want to second guess me or check the things I say, you can feel free to search out there. It's very easily findable. So to answer your question, I'll describe briefly our product development workflow. This is a collaboration between engineering, our product teams, our design and UX group, quality and technical writing. So we all work together on a regular basis to tackle the two tracks of our product development workflow. Within those tracks, there's separate steps, but I'm going to kind of go through them quickly so you understand just how we get new features out to our customers. So the first track is validation, and validation is driven by our product manager. They work most closely with our product designers, but the engineering team has some input as well. This involves our validation backlog step. So we've got to make sure that we're building the right things. And in order to do that, once we have the backlog, they go through a series of steps around problem validation, design, and then solution validation. So this includes interviewing customers, doing usability testing, getting feedback from the engineering team. And that's all done well before we actually start the planning on how we're going to solve the problem. This is just making sure that we're looking at the right problems. So that's the first validation phase. The second phase is the build phase. This is where engineering is less of an informed collaborator and more the driver of these next steps. So once something has passed solution validation, we get into planning. And that is, something that is really ongoing. At least within my team, we try to avoid having big planning meetings. I think that anyone who's been in a Scrum team has probably had the experience where you have to sit down in a several hour-long planning meeting, and people are starting to fall asleep. It's just not very productive or efficient. Well, in true GitLab fashion, we don't have a lot of meetings. We do have some synchronous discussions around our planning breakdown. And our planning breakdown is where we look at a feature epic that our product manager and designer have already gone through the validation phases. And we say, are all the requirements clear? Is it too big? Could we break this down into multiple MVCs? We use the term MVC all the time at GitLab because we want to get out those iterative, beneficial slices of technology to our customer as fast as we can. So if something's going to take us a couple of milestones, and a milestone is a month-long release for us to complete, we try and find a way to break it down further. And then once things have passed the planning breakdown, pretty much everything in our planning at that point is asynchronous. So, and a lot of that planning breakdown is done asynchronous too. We encourage people to ask questions in the issue. We share things in advance so they can look at those design issues and the artifacts from all of that validation phase. And the synchronous discussion is really just to make sure that we've answered all of the final questions. So the next phase is refinement. We break down that work and we assign off the issues to individuals to add implementation plans and put a weight on their issue. This is helpful for capacity planning. And so that's used in the future. And then after that, we, as engineering managers, work with our product managers to schedule things into milestones. So that's the plan portion of our build phase. Then we actually start to build the stuff. So this is the fun part for developers. And this is a pretty standard cycle of development, review, our code review process, and validation. So our code review process, I think, is pretty standard. People are used to a maintainer level review process. So we have a 2 approval process required for all code changes, standard reviewer, and then a maintainer. And only certain, not all GitLab team members are maintainers. You go through a training process to become a maintainer, and you really do emphasize, knowing the entire code base very well. And these are more of the experienced experts. So once you've got that approval, then you deploy and we do testing. And that's our build and test phase. So we launch at that point. I can talk more about our release process if you'd like.
Maybe you can just walk me through all of this broadly right now, and then we can go into more details.
Okay. So, once we've launched, we try and share this with our customers or stakeholders, whether that's through the issue or release posts. We use release posts that we share very widely at the end of each milestone. So our product managers have the honor of putting together both videos and written announcements of the new features that we're launching. And we also encourage dog fooding within our GitLab team. So we build GitLab with GitLab. So when we build something cool into GitLab, we want to make sure that the GitLab team is using it first. So we get that feedback. Oftentimes we'll maybe use a feature flag and turn things on just for GitLab to test it ourselves before we roll it out. But dog fooding is a really big, important part of our launch phase. And then after that, it's back to the product managers and the designers and all of us really, to improve what we've just launched. So for the product managers, they're looking at the product usage data. For the engineering team, we're looking at the performance data, and we're iterating on what we just launched. So then we start all back over again. So as with everything at GitLab, we're always iterating on this. We just recently had a working group that was formed to help improve this product development workflow. So our handbook has been updated fairly recently. And then we're constantly, as individuals can propose changes to this, and we're experimenting within our own team about ways to optimize this process for what works best for us.
Nice. I love your handbook, by the way. I was walking through it a lot while preparing for this conversation. So definitely, so many things are well documented, and it's amazing to learn from. And you mentioned
Fun fact about our handbook: if it was printed, there'd be over 8,000 pages of text. I don't know if anyone's ever done it, but if it was bound in a book, I would totally buy that. And we use it all the time. I've worked at places that have wiki sites or other types of similar sites that aren't used every day. I can tell you that I go to pages in our handbook probably once an hour to answer questions.
Nice. So people come to you with questions and then you go to the handbook?
Yeah, so many times. And it's part of our onboarding where they say, don't be offended if someone replies to your question with a handbook link. We're just proud that we already have it documented. So, I would say 9 times out of 10, if I go out into a Slack channel and ask a question, somebody will give me a nice answer, but then they'll say, here's the handbook link.
Nice. And I know you take pride in having everything documented and having that asynchronous process. So first question, I want to follow up on what you explained about the process, and then we can talk a bit more about the general documentation of processes. So you mentioned that the planning for new features is also done asynchronously, and it's amazing. And I know engineers hate meetings, especially meetings that are that long. So how does that part usually go? Like, do you document everything when it comes to new features, and then people just read through it, add suggestions? How does it happen?
Sure. So, once we've made it through that validation phase, the expectation is that a lot of the questions have been asked around the requirements. So when you get to the build phase, like I said, we try and break things down into small iterative pieces and keep the conversations about how those are going to be solved in the issue. The engineer who gets assigned the issue for refinement gets the freedom to choose how they want to solve it. We encourage them to reach out to team members when things are more complex. In fact, some of our retrospective feedback from last month was that, it would be really good if we started pairing on some of the more complicated refinement, because it does take time and it can be kind of stressful to try and solve those big problems on your own. So that person is still the DRI though. There's still one person who is the DRI for putting together that plan. For issues that are more than about a 2 in weight, so things that are a little bit more complicated, we ask for a refinement review. We know that everybody has different ways of solving problems. And if one person adds a weight in an implementation plan, someone else might have a very different solution. So we ask them, and we actually have a bot that comes through that'll reassign those issues for refinement validation. This is an optional part of the workflow. This is frankly something that my team has started experimenting with, like I mentioned before. So we all have our ongoing experiments on how to improve this workflow. But if this works out for us, we would propose it as a handbook change for the larger engineering organization. Nice. And oftentimes people will jump in and ask questions and continue the conversation. We do have we have a handbook rule that if something goes back and forth more than 3 times, we hop on a synchronous call. For some people, that's not possible, though. You know, I have individuals on my team that they never have time zone overlaps. So even getting 1 hour of time that's convenient for both team members can be a real challenge. So we do our best to make sure we have those conversations asynchronously.
So even in a single team, it happens that one person is, I mean, there's no overlap in time zones.
Definitely. I have 4 front-end engineers that report to me, and they're all the way from being in Turkey to Hawaii to Australia. So there might be an overlap there between Turkey and Australia while I'm sleeping at night, but it is very small.
Nice. So it usually happens that you plan a feature without a call at all, right?
It is very often. When something is especially small, it won't even go through this entire planning breakdown process, and we'll do this completely asynchronously. You know, I know that especially with our designer who is very involved, oftentimes, especially front-end engineers will hop on a call with him just to make sure that they're understanding everything correctly. We do have some great design features in our issue tracker that we're using. So it helps us facilitate the conversation for those designs.
I'm really fascinated about this whole documentation thing because, you know, I'm guilty of sometimes trying to save time by not explaining enough or by not documenting enough. And then it ends up in just going back and forth with the team and then keep the discussions on until the release itself. So this is...
We've all been there.
Definitely. Yeah. Great. And again, regarding the documentation, does it happen that, you know, you mentioned that people come to you with questions, you answer them with links from the handbook. How hard is it for you as a company to shift engineers in this mindset of reading documentation and trying to find answers over there instead of asking questions in the team?
It's a great question. I wouldn't say we're trying to shift anyone. We're trying to hire people that are already ready to embrace this. I think it's a big part of our recruiting and our interview process. Just to give you a little bit of insight into that, given that we don't have an office, we're never asking anyone to come in for an interview and whiteboard code. So we have a take-home code review assignment that you do, and then a pair programming session after that. That's what consists of our technical interview, which I really appreciate because we're not trying to exercise how you perform in a time of high stress. We want to know how you work at work. So after that technical interview, there's a couple of rounds of behavioral interviews, both with the hiring manager and a peer, and then depending on the role, sometimes with a director as well. And a lot of the questions are focused around how you would handle transparency, asynchronous communication, documentation. Like these types of things are very fundamental to our values at GitLab. So that's a big part of what we're looking for when we're hiring people. And it is uncomfortable for some people. I'm not saying that everybody comes in just ready to do this. I know me personally, it took me a little while to really understand the benefits of asynchronous discussions and communications. And it's not just because we have a historical record. That was the big thing that killed me in meetings in the past, is we'd have these big discussions and we'd come out of that and like, oh, we all know what we're doing now. And then like 2 weeks later, we're all, you know, on different pages and we all interpreted it just a little bit differently. You know, the historical record and the being all on the same page, that's a very clear benefit. The thing I like the most about the asynchronous communication is that I get the opportunity to put as much context into every issue comment or issue description or Slack message. I often find myself linking to handbook pages. You know, it lets me reread things we do hire all over the world, but we expect everyone to speak in English. So for folks that aren't native English speakers, it gives them that opportunity to really make sure that they're communicating at the standard that they want to be in the most clear possible way. There's so many benefits from this that just weren't clear to me when I first joined the company.
Has it happened, I mean, just out of curiosity, in your own team, for example, to work with someone for a longer period of time and never talk actually or meet on a video call?
I would say not within my smaller team. So I can explain the structures of teams a little bit, but there's a front end team and a back end team that I work very closely with. And with that, 12 engineers and our other back end engineering manager and our stable counterparts, there's no one that I haven't sat down and had a coffee chat with. And I'll explain what that is in a second. But there's definitely people in other parts of the organization that I've never met. And I think that's true of all companies. We do usually get to have an annual in-person event that we call Contribute, and we were all very disappointed when we didn't get to go to Prague next year. They're already starting to see if we can plan our next one, but that is our opportunity to meet in person. So coffee chats, I mean, obviously, without having any kind of face-to-face meetings, it does make it a lot harder to get to know people, and we want to get to know people on a personal level. So GitLab encourages everyone to schedule coffee chats, and they even have a channel where you can go and get randomly assigned to someone for a coffee chat, and it's just a quick half-hour informal discussion or conversation about yourself. And there's certain people that I've started to have coffee chats with since I started here, and now I have regularly scheduled ones because we just hit it off. I have not met anyone in person, but I've made some real friends in this job, which I think is an impressive thing to say.
Yeah, that's amazing. Great. So let's talk a bit about how the teams are organized. You're a huge organization, but split into multiple smaller teams. So how do you all collaborate between each other? Is there a collaboration between multiple teams, or are you mostly independently working? And then how is the collaboration going between the product and the development teams, apart from what we already discussed?
So if you've used GitLab, you might be aware of the different stages of the product as part of our documentation. So we organize as teams largely around these stages: plan, create, verify, package, release, configure, protect, monitor, secure, and manage. These are the big functional stages of our product, and that is how our teams are set up for the most part. There are exceptions to that. My team spans 2 stages. For example, I have groups in the protect stage and the secure stage, but that's not very common. Most teams are focused on one stage of the product. Under each stage, they're divided off into groups. So I keep using that term, and it's an intentional term. So there's a hierarchy here. There's the stages, and then under the stages, there are groups. Within the groups, there are actually categories as well. And categories might be considered high-level capabilities that would be a standalone product at another company. So in some cases, there's a team at the category level, depending on how big that effort is. For my team, for example, we're at the group level, and we have 1 or 2 categories that we support. In the case of Protect, my team manages that whole stage. There's no other groups within Protect because it is a new stage of the product. So we're working on container network security and some brand new features for that stage of the product. In Secure, on the other hand, my team is 1 group out of 5, and each of the other 5 groups has their own engineering manager. I'm a front-end engineering manager. Our groups are split up between front-end and back-end. There are some exceptions to that as well, but for the most part, each group has a back-end set of developers and a front-end set of developers. I found that the ratio between front-end and back-end is about 1 front-end developer to every 3 back-end developers. So there's a lot of cases where 1 front-end team spans multiple groups, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Let me see if there's any other, go ahead.
I wanted to ask if you compare this, I'm not sure how it was in your previous organizations, but for example, having 1 person involved in multiple stages of the product, as opposed to having things split up nicely like this, and then I know what I work on and I don't need to care about the other part of the code. So what are the benefits of one?
For the most part, people are focused on one area of the product. And I think my team, like I said, is a bit of an exception, but I wouldn't say that anyone ever just wants to care about that one part of the code. There are so many reasons to branch out. And I think you asked that earlier and I didn't address it at all, is that we do get to collaborate with other stages of the product very regularly, whether that be because we need to make changes to their area of the product to support our features, which we've definitely done. So for example, if we need to add a configuration for someone who has a Jira integration set up for their product, and we don't ask the configure team to make those changes, we get in there and do that. But obviously we want to be communicating with those teams so that they know that we're doing that. At GitLab, anyone can contribute. And that sounds a little hokey, and I know that's kind of our tagline, but it's totally true. So community contributors, team members in different stages, engineering managers like myself can hop in. So that collaboration is really key. And that is no different than what I described before. That happens in the issue, that happens in the MR, that happens asynchronously, outside of our own team as well. In past companies, I've experienced mostly full stack teams, and they've been not organized so much. I mean, I haven't worked on a product team quite like GitLab to compare it to, really.
Right. Okay.
Sorry, before you move on, one more thing to add, because you also asked about our relationship with the product teams, and I don't think I hit on that at all. So we have stable counterparts assigned to each group. So at the group level, there's a product manager, a product designer, a technical writer, and a software engineer and test. So our automated testing expert. For the most part, each group gets one stable counterpart. Again, there are exceptions. For smaller groups, a technical writer might span more than one group. But they are basically part of our team. They come to the synchronous discussions that we have. They participate in our retrospectives. We all work very closely within that group structure, almost like one team.
So are the responsibilities split, like the technical writer writes the documentation, developers develop, testers test, or are they, interchanging?
It depends. Yeah, it depends on the group, and it depends on the coverage that we have from those technical writers and the SETs. In some cases, the SET will handle all of the creation of the automated tests. In some cases, the SET will maybe write the test plan, and the engineering team will create those tests under their guidance. With technical writing, we really expect the engineer to update the documentation as features change, and then we get technical writers' approval. There are cases with bigger features that we're collaborating a lot more closely in the early phases of the documentation changes.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
And what are some things that you'd like to emphasize that make your engineering team more effective, or tips for other companies?
I think I've already talked about our hiring a little bit, but I think that is the first thing that I would say, is that hiring people that are going to fit into our culture, be successful as a manager of one. And I think that's a term that you'll find in our handbook described much better than I can, but it's really the idea that there's nobody that's sitting next to you in the cubicle over to make sure that you're doing your job. And oftentimes you have a lot of freedom around, which issue you're going to grab to start working on, or how you're going to prioritize your time. I mean, to illustrate that, all meetings are optional. If you're not able to attend a meeting, no one's going to get on you about that. We expect you to read the agenda and watch the video, but you are responsible for making sure that you have that information to act on as needed in the future. So hiring people that can handle that, that's our biggest first step in being successful. It does limit us. We don't hire a lot of entry-level engineers for that reason. It's hard from an onboarding perspective. The second thing I would add is onboarding. Our onboarding is very thorough. So once you come on board, you still are doing everything asynchronously. You're still a manager of one, and you're figuring out how GitLab works. I wouldn't say entirely on your own, but a lot more independently than you would in other jobs. You get assigned a buddy. That buddy is there to help you. Obviously, your engineering manager is going to help you, but we give you great onboarding issues that walk you through all of the things that you need to get the right access and knowledge, and then a separate issue to make sure you know everything about your team. Making sure that team onboarding process is something that I'm constantly iterating on with my fellow backend manager. it needs to be updated all the time. Things change quite a bit. And I think we all know that some of those types of templates can get out of date really easily. So making sure that we keep everything very current and that is as effective as it can be.
And how long is the onboarding process usually?
Oh, I don't know if anyone ever finishes the full onboarding issue. I don't know if I've seen that happen. I think on average, I've seen people keep the main onboarding issue open for about a month. I think we expect people to be fully onboarded by about 6 weeks. Again, it depends on the individual. Someone who might have been a contributor to GitLab in the community in the past would be a lot more comfortable jumping in than someone who's maybe come from another company and hasn't maybe used our tool as much. So it's all dependent on the circumstance.
And you mentioned manager of one, that means manager of myself if I join, right?
Yeah, as a manager, it's a hard thing to say too, because I have to really think about what my role is when we have these expectations on individual contributors to manage their own time. It gives me a lot of opportunity to focus on their conversations around their career development, my own career development, the orchestration of our day-to-day. But yeah, if you really are making sure that you are, we don't look to see if you're working for 8 hours a day. And we have a tell, don't ask policy with time off. So you really do have the freedom to plan your day, plan your week, but there's still expectations that you're being productive. We do have engineering throughput metrics that we look at, mostly as averages across the team, but it's also as a engineering manager, there's a lot of responsibility on me to make sure that no one's taking advantage of that type of attitude.
Right. I want to go into more detail about that, the measurements and everything, but just one other question about this. So you mentioned before that you have the technical part of the interview and then the personality
behavioral, I think is behavioral. What we call it, right?
Yes, right. So has it happened that someone was very strong technically, but didn't quite fit the role, the culture, and then you decided to onboard them, and then what happened?
So I've definitely had cases where we have said no to people that are very technically competent to the job, but we didn't have a lot of confidence that they would be able to handle some of the remote nature or other aspects of the GitLab culture. I have not experienced what you just described yet. I do think that we do a good job of catching those situations, and I think our culture is something that people want to adapt to. There's very few cases where people come on board and this just feels unnatural. We've had cases where people have left the company, but not for that reason that I'm aware of. I'm sure that there are some, sorry.
I meant more of a, whether you had to train someone to adapt to that, and how would that process go if that has to happen?
So, excuse me. I think coaching is always important. I think I was an example of somebody who came in who needed a little bit of coaching around certain areas, like taking notes and meeting agendas and, excuse me. The transparency, I think, is really the big piece that requires a little bit of encouragement, making sure that people understand the benefit that we all get from more thorough, ongoing, I don't want to say updates, that might be the wrong word, but that's what I'm thinking of. So whether it's updates or check-ins or just, hey, I'm picking this up, I've completed this work. I had an engineer on my team point out to me how synchronous our stand-up is. So our stand-up is on Slack. We use a Slack bot stand-up. Once a day, everyone goes in and answers those standards stand-up questions. How are you doing? What did you do yesterday? What are you doing today? Are you blocked? And one of the engineers said, well, I don't want to wait for someone else to go and put their stand-up update in. We should be putting the comments in the issues in the MR as those things happen if we're truly being asynchronous. So this is a case where someone on my team actually taught me things about this. So I think that we're all coaching each other and how to do this better.
Did you start doing that?
Oh, yeah. We still do stand-up. And I question sometimes the value of what are you doing? What did you do yesterday? What are you doing today? But we do learn a lot about each other and how are you feeling? And then as a manager, I always think calling out things that are blocked as loudly and frequently as you can is important. Right. But I think as much as possible, I am trying to adopt that advice that I received from my employee, and he has really excelled at it. So I always joke that he's my role model when it comes to transparency.
Yeah, that's great. And it's a great advice. You mentioned about measurements. I want to get back to that. So what's your strategy for, effectively planning milestones? How do you measure velocity, performance? Let's talk a bit about all of that.
Sure. So every team is different when it comes to milestone planning. Some teams are very focused on getting deliverable features out, by the end of the milestone. My team focuses on iteration a lot more. And I think that's really the overall GitLab advice is don't focus so much on the planning as breaking things. Sorry, planning is wrong. Don't focus so much on the milestone deliverables as the iterative planning. So we break features down into small enough pieces that even if we don't complete the entire feature by the end of the milestone, we have still provided the most important pieces because they were broken off and prioritized first. Sometimes this means that we have to sacrifice a little bit of functionality. For example, we just recently implemented some bulk updates of our vulnerability reports. In the original requirements, there was comments with each of the bulk updates. We launched initially without the comments, and we provided a huge amount of value to our customer. Unfortunately, the commenting piece won't make it into our 1310 milestone, but we'll still get this big benefit for our customer out. So our milestone, we launched to production multiple times a day for GitLab.com, but we also support self-hosted users that do not upgrade until our releases that go out on the 22nd of every month. So there is this sort of, I don't want to say rush to a cutoff date, but by the 16th or 17th, if you don't have your MRs merged for that milestone, they're most likely not going to make it in for those self-hosted users. And if we can't get features available for all users, we don't announce them in our release posts. So,
but they would still be available silently on GitLab. Yeah,
they'd still be available for GitLab.com users. We do use feature flags liberally, like I said before. So once something is feature flagged on by default, that's when we announce it. We want to make sure that it's available for everybody without them having to take special actions to turn it on.
Right.
So as far as the milestone planning goes, my team does assign weights to feature issues so that we can get at least a confident count of how many issues that we can pull into the next milestone. This isn't a science, this is something that I, as an engineering manager, handle mostly myself, along with the product manager as far as priorities go. That's pretty much the extent of the velocity for sprint planning. We do look at engineering metrics, like I said, across the team. This is pretty independent of the milestones. If you look at the dashboards that we have for this, they aren't delineated by the milestones at all. This is looking at things like mean time to merge and narrow MR rates, which when I say narrow, I mean not including things like community contributors or other engineers that might contribute to our stage. Like for our group, how many MRs have been merged on average per developer. So there's goals set within engineering. I think the MR rate is set at around 9 right now. And I don't want to misspeak on the mean time to merge. I think it's around 5 days right now, but I could be wrong. Our handbook will answer that better than me. So those are some of the common metrics that we use. Additionally, we track things like say-do ratios. My team doesn't focus on those as much though.
So this doesn't depend on the actual release, but it's more of a general metric that you do, right?
That's correct. That's correct. So I know that I don't know as far as release metrics go what we're tracking there. I know that there are the number of issues that are closed and things like that, but it differs per team. It's a hard thing to track because, like I said, we break our issues down into very, very small chunks. So for us, we might close 30 issues because they're all very small, whereas another team might operate at a different level and keep their issues a little bit larger. So their bar is much different than ours.
And how small are the issues in your team usually?
So we struggled with this one at first because we all really wanted the equivalent of Jira subtasks. We want something that's going to track the individual action. And because we have this front end and back end separation within our team, there were cases where we had one issue that required both front end and back end work. Say, for example, a back-end engineer would pick up that issue and move it through our workflow on our board. It would end up in dev and in review, and then a front-end engineer wouldn't have seen that until the front-end work wasn't getting done. So we had decided to break things down, even at that level, even if a feature was maybe only a 3-point as far as weights go with the front-end and back-end, we've made the decision to break them down into 2 pieces so they can be, they can move independently through our workflow, be assigned to individuals. Usually if an issue is bigger than a 5, I have actually not seen an issue bigger than a 5 in our milestones in months. And even at a 5, we look to say, okay, how can we make this a little bit smaller? Because that's a big complex issue, and there's a good chance that it won't make it in the milestone.
Right. Nice. Interesting. And you touched again a bit on the release process. Let's talk a bit more about that. So like you mentioned, feature toggles and stuff like that. How do you usually, apart from the daily releases, what does this usually involve?
So you mean for the feature flag specifically, or for the monthly milestone releases?
No, in general, like the release process. You release daily. So what does that involve for you to be successful to release daily? What are the parts of the process, and also the monthly releases if they are different somehow?
As with any company that's releasing this quickly, having strong automated tests is very important to us. We try to be as efficient as we can around leveraging code that exists in other parts of the application, and we want to have a high level of confidence that we are not breaking anything. So we don't put a lot of effort into manual testing. There is checks that go in, usually by another developer. We try to make sure that someone besides the author of the code is running those tests, but we also work very closely with our SET stable counterparts to make sure that we have automated tests, as well as within our own engineering team, high unit test coverage. So that's a standard agile approach. The other thing I would say to call out is that because we deploy so quickly, we often don't have a period of time where we can test out on our staging environment before something goes live. So expecting maintainers and reviewers to do testing as well. They'll pull down the branch, test it locally. That is one other measure of reducing risk. And then using feature flags very strategically. So, I've had stories of engineers on my team who submitted a merge request. It made it through reviewer and maintainer review while they were sleeping at night and deployed to production before they woke up in the morning. So they never had an opportunity to actually look at it anywhere except for their local environment prior to it being in production. So we really need to find ways to make sure that in those scenarios that things are still of the quality that we expect them to be. So feature flags allow us to do that. That's one way. Like I said, the automated tests, and also depending on other team members to do their testing.
So they always go to the GitLab team at first because you use GitLab for work as well, and then go to the actual customers, right?
Not always. Sometimes we just launch things for everybody. So GitLab.com is all customers that are using our hosted platform. Like I said, there are occasions. We just recently launched a new filter on our vulnerability dashboard that we originally launched for the whole population. And we realized, given our configuration of scanners, this isn't quite what we expected it to look like. So we reverted our change. We flipped off our feature flag. And we decided to, after we made updates to address what we experienced, then we turned it on just for GitLab so we could test it against our use case, which might be different than other customers. We all contribute to one large monolith. I don't know if that's the case of all of our customers. So we're exercising one particular use case, but not all of them. So I hope that answered your question.
Yes.
I think of anything else. I mentioned the security. I bring up security a lot because I work on the vulnerability management team. Other thing to call out is that as part of our pipeline, we run a number of security scanners: container scanning, SAST, DAST, fuzzing, dependency scanning, secret detection. These all run with each pipeline. We are working on improving our security approvals process so that when new vulnerabilities are found, the MR will actually be required to have an approval by an AppSec team member or a defined security expert to determine whether that should be merged or not. Mm-hmm. That's not in place right now, but I think that this is one of the areas where GitLab is really unique in this functionality that we provide.
That's great. We have a few, many audience questions. Let's see. So there's one, this is from the beginning, but I think we answered it already. How often do you release new features? Do you have predefined release dates? Yes.
Yeah, I hope I covered that already. So the 22nd of every month, that'll change based on holidays or weekends. But it's been, I think we've released once a month, every month for years now.
I think we were ahead of the audience with the question. So there is another one: how do we measure success in your engineering team? That we already answered as well. Bug report.
I think I want to add to the question of measuring success. I think as a manager, a big part of my job is to have those ongoing career development discussions. And we have really well-defined career matrices. So if you're a senior engineer on our team, whether you're on my team or on a different stage of the product, there is a very thorough career matrix that we get to look at to see how people are achieving. And it's really, and we contribute to that, and we get to have a say in what that looks like. That is one way that we measure success, I would say, in addition to looking at standard engineering metrics and what we as a team have produced.
Is that also in the handbook, or is that private?
Yes, the career matrix is also in the handbook.
How could I ask?
Again, unless well, in addition to our handbook, we have product documentation. So I don't want to always say handbook is how we work. The product documentation is how GitLab works. Unless if it's about maybe customers or our applicants for recruiting, everything is public in one of those two areas.
Right. How do you handle bug reports coming from end users?
Great question. So I see them once they've actually been added to our backlog. So as far as, I don't know what the exact triage process is with our support teams to get those bugs to us. But once they do come to the engineering team backlog, we assign a priority and a severity to them. And then we prioritize those with our product manager and try and make sure that we don't accumulate a lot of debt. There are low priority bugs that end up sort of, rotting in backlogs. That happens everywhere. Yeah. But, security bugs, security issues have their own very strict process to make sure that they are backported to other releases, to make sure that they aren't disclosed to the public.
Okay. There's another question about internal knowledge sharing sessions to allow people to get to know the project and solution better and how the technology is being used. And I'm assuming this is done in the onboarding process, and again, is done asynchronously.
Once you've onboarded, you want to make sure that you continue to improve your knowledge over time. So there are a lot of brown bags and AMAs and working sessions. As much as possible, we encourage people to record any kind of presentation points in advance so that those meetings are really focused on the discussion and the questions. But we have a GitLab team meeting calendar that's shared by everybody. And there's a lot of opportunities if you want to learn about a different stage of the product. If you're sharing your own stage, we have monthly group, that's not the right, group, not in the term that I was using before, but we have, they use the term group calls, but, for example, we'll talk deep dive into the secure section on a regular basis, or the create section. So you have synchronous meetings that you can go to learn about those areas as well. And then from a technical perspective, we also have like front-end pairing sessions is something that we see often. Lots of brown bags on certain technologies. So there's definitely opportunities for that internal knowledge sharing. And Slack, from the asynchronous perspective, we have such an active Slack instance that discusses technical and non-technical topics internally.
That's great. And so there is a question about the handbook and keeping it.
I love that question.
Of course.
It's such a great question. We are all responsible for it. So, I have certain goals to make, a certain number of handbook updates every month. We encourage everybody to fix broken links, change things that they find that are incorrect. Going back to that career matrix, that's part of what we're asking engineers to do as well. We are all owners of the handbook.
But in general, the managers are the ones who are writing the content, or?
No. Not at all. Again, it is there. I don't think there's any one person that is responsible. There might be sections where you have DRIs or owners for certain parts of the handbook, but there's never an expectation that DR is the only person that's contributing to it. So for example, we have the threat management portion of the handbook, which I have authored a lot of the content for, but I really encourage other people to go in and add things, write new things. So I wouldn't say that it's even owned by me at all.
Right. Yeah, that's amazing. And I guess it comes down to the hiring again, like people who want to do that and who are more proactive. And, that's why you can keep it up to date without having one person responsible for it.
And there are certain people that are more frequent updaters than others. I think that some engineers really want to focus on their code. And then there's some product managers who are updating the handbook, 5 times a day. So everyone's got a different cadence there.
The next question is again around releases. Do you practice continuous deployment?
We don't practice continuous deployment, and that we don't deploy to production with every merge. We do have merge request trains, and I know our frequency of deployments to production has increased drastically over the year that I've been at the company. When I first started, we were just deploying to production once a week. Then it went to 3 times a week, and now we're deploying multiple times a day. But we're not deploying with every merge. So I think that is the textbook definition of continuous deployment.
Right. And is there a specific reason, or it's just not part of the process?
I don't want to speak incorrectly on this. It could have to do with load and the amount of engineers that are contributing to the same code base at once.
Right. Okay.
Our handbook can answer that question, Igor.
There's another thing about the issues coming from customers, or big issues that come up in prioritizing. So I know you mentioned you're not very familiar with the triaging process and everything, but if you have any insight about how the hierarchy of issues is done, and how do you decide what to start with if there are multiple big issues?
My main answer to that is our priority labels. So if we receive a bug that has a priority 1, our expectation is that we're addressing that above everything else. So those SLAs for a priority 1 are much shorter. I think for a priority 3, we're expected to fix something within 30 to 60 days. With a priority 2, it's under 30 days. And with a priority 1, we are expected to be acting on it immediately with a fix, I think, within a week. So, we can't always get something out to our self-hosted customers right away. We do have frequent patch releases as needed. But for me as an engineering manager, my indicator that something needs to be handled immediately is that priority label. Our PMs do a great job of communicating whatever the motivating factor is. There's a customer, or if we're causing availability issues. So it's handled based on, I would say, very clear and frequent and transparent communications, as well as documenting things in the issues. We get a lot of reports of things from external sources like HackerOne, community members. So that triage process, and I think how they determine whether something is a high priority, that's something that I would encourage Bruno to take a look for in our handbook.
And do you usually involve users in rating the issues as they come, or is it mostly on the maintainer side, on your side at GitLab? What I'm asking, for example, if I report some bug, do other users rate it, and then based on that you prioritize the fixes, or is it mostly done by
We do have a voting option within our issue tracker. I don't see it used for that purpose. It's usually more internally if there's a process change that people are really excited about, and that's a way to vote things up. So no, it's really the discretion of our product manager.
Right. Okay. In terms of the QA team, we have a question from Davor. He's asking, how is the testing process handled? I know you mentioned you have test engineers in all of the groups, as you call them, but maybe we can talk a bit about testing in general. How involved are the QA engineers? How involved are the developers themselves? Is it more of a mentoring, or just picking up all of the responsibilities on the test engineer side?
Right. So again, this varies widely based on the group. And I have been spending a lot of time talking to different SETs and different engineering managers about the way their collaboration is working and what's not working. My team currently has a couple of KRs, so OKRs, key results, for this quarter around improving our knowledge for end-to-end testing. And in one case, because again, I said I have 2 groups that my team is over. In one case, it's about improving our knowledge, because we have a very dedicated SET that has the resources to support us. He's been working on that area of the product for a long time. So it's really just making sure that we understand how we can contribute, understanding what his process looks like, suggesting improvements, and making sure that we are collaborating with him as efficiently as we can. And the other group that I'm working on, we have an SCT who's a manager. She doesn't have resources that are currently assigned to us. So we don't actually have any end-to-end test coverage right now. So it's up to the engineering team to build that testing. So it's a very different KR for that team, because we are actually asking them to build the first set of end-to-end tests to exercise, a full feature within that group. So just even with my own team, I can illustrate how we have, very different circumstances. I've been fortunate to make friends with an SCT who tells me that her relationship with the engineering team is strictly at advisory level. She has so many engineers that move so quickly that she can't write the end-to-end tests for every feature that comes through. So with each feature that's being planned, she will look at the feature issue and add her suggested end-to-end test plan, which then the engineers execute on entirely. So these are three very different ways that these teams are working together today. And I think that I've heard this from many different groups within GitLab right now, that there's a lot of us that are looking to not just improve, but understand better how we can get more involved as a development organization. I'm sorry, I say engineering and that's wrong. Our SCTs are part of engineering, our development organization.
Yep. Okay. And in terms of security, because you're a distributed team, how do you ensure the security within the code base, the privacy of data and everything?
We're open source, so we don't. Our code is out there for everyone to see. So from that perspective, we don't have concerns there. How we ensure security in that people aren't compromising our product by merging malicious code, that is partially based on our reviewer maintainer process that I described. We do have red teams. Just recently there was a red team within GitLab that tried to go through this process of sort of building trust with the community contributor, or kind of making up a community contributor and getting engineers to trust that community contributor, and then having them try to merge a malicious change. Fortunately, our reviewer maintainer process caught that. So, they're trying to exercise that in that way. But because of our public nature, we're not putting firewalls around our code or access to our code or our databases. These are things that are public. As far as systems that are secured within GitLab for things like, people ops or finance, we've got our own Okta system for that internally. In addition to what I just described, ensuring security through our security scanners, making sure we're not introducing vulnerabilities. That's our other approach.
Right.
I hope that answered that.
Yeah, it did. Are there any release analysis you do after the features hit production?
All the time. So, we do have, standard performance metrics, such as site speed, looking at page load performance. We've got, all the standard tools that you would expect. As far as how the feature is performing with customers, I'm not quite sure. I know that they do a lot of customer interviews. I was talking about that phase in the product development workflow where we get to the last phase of improve. It's kind of going back to that solution validation. So we're building on the features that we've already delivered. So we are now testing what the customers think of features built on top of that. So I think our product designers and our product managers do that largely through customer conversations. I know the designer that I work with and PM that I work with, I've been doing some really great surveys and sort of like Figma stack ranking type questionnaires where internal and external customers can provide feedback about how important certain features would be for them. But I think any of that feature-based release analysis would be done by our PMs. We get a lot of feedback from customers. It's great. I mean, especially in my area of the product, because the secure stage of GitLab is one of the things that you get for paying for our higher tiers of the product. We have very vocal customers who tell us what's working and what's not. And I know that our PM creates relationships with some of these customers to get very quick feedback too.
Yeah, that's great. We have two questions around clean code, technical debt, refactoring. So one thing is how do you keep maintaining clean code, and how how do you handle refactoring if needed? And then if you end up having technical debt intentionally to deal with something that has to be done quickly.
So, as an engineering manager, I'm not a fan of stopping feature development to tackle technical debt. So when we do accrue technical debt, we try and address it in parallel to feature delivery. I personally try to, when we're planning milestones, prioritize the feature delivery issues at the top of the milestone so that they can make it into the release. And then the technical debt are items that we definitely prioritize, but if they, these aren't part of our release announcements, these aren't, customer features they're waiting for. So if they don't get deployed by the 17th for the milestone release, but they still get done in the milestone, to me, that's a big win. How to deter that technical debt in the first place, that is an ongoing conversation with your friendly maintainer and reviewer. So I think there's a fine line to be walked between ensuring that we're delivering the most high quality debt-free code and actually getting the feature out. So, and there's cases where a maintainer might look at a code review and say, okay, the feature that you added is fine, but there's all this garbage around it, right? We don't necessarily want to block that feature from going to customers. So we encourage those discussions to create follow-up issues. And then those follow-up issues are prioritized like I just described. So I think that is our main source of deterring that of ensuring that we don't build up that technical debt. And we really expect a lot from our maintainers and our reviewers in that respect.
Yeah, I think it's a very healthy way to look at it, especially because, you don't stop everything just because something needs to be refactored or optimized. It just continues to move forward.
I think that if you are introducing debt as part of your feature change, that is something that wouldn't, there's less cases where you could just create a follow-up and move forward. So I think that's where the expectation is that if you're writing something new, do it the best way possible.
Right. Related to this, there's one about the fastest time to production, and I think we can close with that one because we're at the end of the session. So what is the fastest time to production a team could achieve with GitLab?
I unfortunately know this way too well because, we've had production incidences that we've had to handle and we have gotten them fixed within the fastest would be probably about 6 hours, right? So you write it could be less depending on where you hit it with that time of day deploy. So you write your code fix, that could take someone maybe an hour. Let's just hypothetically say that. Your reviewer could be very attentive. So say it takes that reviewer a total of say a few minutes to pick it up and pass it on to a maintainer. There have been cases where we've been able to assign production bugs directly to maintainers because we needed to get them through very quickly. So in that case, let's say that's even less than an hour. And then when things get picked up based on that time of day. So it could be under 6 hours even. What gets hard is that we recently had a regression that was introduced just before our 13.9 milestone. We were able to get a fix out to the .com environment, within that 2 or 3 hour window, but unfortunately we missed the cutoff for the milestone. So we created a patch, we were part of a patch release that went out about 2 days later. So customers that were self-hosted would have to pick up that patch release, but they were able to get that fix within a 2-day window.
And what about features? So like if it's a new feature that you work on, how fast could you move it to production?
We wouldn't put the same pressure on reviewers or maintainers to, jump on those reviews as quickly, but there's really no reason why it wouldn't be any different. If all of the stars align and you're able to get a maintainer or a reviewer who's there immediately and doesn't have a lot of feedback, and they pass it on to the maintainer and they pick it up immediately and don't have a lot of feedback, I would say you could get something out there within an hour if that deployment is happening to production within that window.
That's cool.
Yeah, it is. It's neat. But we do, I think that for that, because we want to benefit everyone, we do want to make sure that things go to .com before we say they're fixed. Or it's not .com, sorry, to self-hosted users before we say they're fixed and live.
Right. Let's end it with this. Do you deploy on Fridays?
We deploy in production on Fridays. We deploy 3 times. We deploy several times every day, and that includes Fridays now.
Right.
We didn't used to. When we were deployed every couple of times a week, Friday was not one of the days. But Friday for me is different than Friday in Australia. So, it depends on whose Friday you're talking about.
Cool. Great. Thank you, Lindsay, again for joining us today. Everyone, thank you for attending. Make sure to subscribe on our YouTube channel. This will go there. I mean, it's already there because we were streaming live. And if you're looking for a remote job or need help expanding your engineering team remotely, make sure to check out our website and get in touch with us. Thanks, Lindsay, again.
Thank you, Katerina. This has been really fun.